President Bashar al-Assad meets Chinese Deputy Foreign Minister. Chai Juan says China's stand towards what is happening in Syria is based on objectivity and justice. President al-Assad says reform steps run in parallel with restoring stability. The Mauritanian Prime Minister says what is taking place in Syria aims at fragmenting Syria and undermining its leading role. Russia says violence in Syria rises because of gunmen's activities. And an armed terrorist group targets Tishreen main fuel storage tanks and Homs oil refinery. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to News in English, live from our news center here in Damascus. Relations between Syria and China and the current situation in Syria were the centerpiece of the talks held between President Bashar al-Assad and Chinese Deputy Foreign Minister Chai Juan, who affirmed that China's stand towards what is happening in Syria is based on a responsible policy that depends on objectivity, justice, and adherence to the principles of international law. He added that this policy aims at achieving the interests of the Syrian people and restoring security and stability to Syria, pointing out that Syria's stability is a basic element for the stability of the region as a whole. Chai Juan clarified that China supports the reform process in Syria and the steps achieved, stressing that his country would continue to play its positive role that aims at finding a political solution for the crisis through dialogue among all parties away from foreign interference, pointing out that Syria has a rich political experience that makes it able to achieve this objective. President Bashar al-Assad expressed appreciation for China's people and leadership for their stance towards Syria. His Excellency pointed out that targeting Syria aims basically at dividing it and undermining its geopolitical position. The President stressed that Syria would press ahead with the political reform process according to a clear plan and timetable.
I made a deep and a frank exchange of views with President al-Assad concerning the Syrian issue. As a friend of Syria, China follows up the developments of the situation with great interest. We feel deep concern about the escalation of the crisis in Syria. I briefed President Bashar al-Assad on the Chinese political principled stand towards the Syrian crisis, which is represented by calling on the Syrian government, the armed groups, and the opposition to end the violence against civilians and the necessity of restoring stability to Syria as soon as possible, because stability and development are in the interest of the Syrian people. Under stable circumstances, Syria can make comprehensive political reforms. In other words, China calls for ending the violent acts, and all parties should conduct a dialogue to reach a comprehensive political plan and its mechanisms. We hope that the referendum on the new constitution and the parliamentary elections would be held smoothly. China's objective and fair stand towards the Syrian crisis emerges from the basic interests of the Syrian people, and China has no subjective aims concerning this issue.
Foreign Minister Walid al-Muallim met the Chinese Deputy Foreign Minister and the accompanying delegation. During his talks with Deputy Foreign Minister Dr. Faisal al-Maqdad, Chai Juan reiterated China's principled stance regarding the Syrian crisis and that the sovereignty, integrity, independence and safety of the Syrian territories must be respected by all sides and by the international community. He added that China supports the Syrian people's independent choice, national dialogue and future reforms, voicing hope for achieving progress in this field. President Bashar al-Assad on Friday received a letter from Mauritanian President Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz on the current developments in the Syrian arena, conveyed by Mauritania's Prime Minister Moulay Ould Mohamed al-Qazaf. President al-Assad presented a review on the reality of what is happening in Syria and the attempts of targeting it by all means to create chaos. The President reviewed the steps of political reform being carried out by the state, stressing that such steps are running in parallel with restoring security and stability and protecting citizens. The Mauritanian Prime Minister, for his part, referred to the danger of targeting Syria, considering that Syria's stability is essential for the security and stability of Arab countries and the region. He said that the aim behind what is taking place is fragmenting Syria and undermining its historical and leading role in the region. Al-Qazaf reviewed his country's view on the means of getting out of the crisis of Syria. President al-Assad expressed appreciation of the efforts exerted by Mauritania to help Syria overcome this stage. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Dr. Adel Safar met Mr. al-Qazaf. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Bogdanov said that the level of violence in Syria has risen over the past period because of the gunmen's activities, calling on the opposition that rules over the armed groups to give the order to these groups to stop their provocative operations against the Syrian authorities. In his speech at Valdai Forum, Bogdanov described the so-called Friends of Syria group as a group of amateurs aimed at interfering in Syria's affairs, including military interference, stressing that such interference constitutes a violation of international law and the UN legitimacy. Bogdanov added that the level of violence in Syria has remarkably risen over the past period, clarifying that this was not because of the behavior of the Syrian authorities, which rather did their best, particularly during the presence of the Arab observers in Syria, to reduce the level of violence. He said Syrian authorities withdrew military vehicles and forces from the streets and cities, released thousands of detainees, and didn't prevent peaceful protests. He concluded that in case the opposition doesn't rule over the armed groups, then it should dissociate itself from the extremists and terrorists and call on those close to it to stop dealing with the gunmen. Authorities seized a Hyundai pickup vehicle at Al Rasafa area in Al Raqqa countryside carrying weapons. The authorities confiscated more than 59 Kalashnikov rifles and ammunition that were hidden in the car. A terrorist armed group targeted at around 3 a.m. today Tishreen main fuel storage tanks in Homs refinery by mortars. The mortars hit 2 fuel tanks that contain more than 50 million liters. However, firefighters managed to extinguish the fire. Earlier in Al Sultaniya and Bab Amr area in Homs, an armed terrorist group sabotaged an oil pipeline which resulted in a fire at the explosion site. A source at the Ministry of Oil and Mineral Resources said that the Syrian company for transporting crude oil was cooperating with the concerned bodies to take all necessary measures for repairing the damages. It is to be noted that another terrorist group targeted on the 15th of this month a pipeline for transporting diesel from Homs refinery to oil reserves in Adra in Damascus countryside, detonating it by an explosive device in an area between Bab Amr and Al Sultaniya. In Daraa countryside, an armed terrorist group detonated 2 explosive devices near Al Amal hospital in Jassim town, which resulted in the wounding of 3 people. In Khirbat Ghazal town, the army's engineering units dismantled 2 explosive devices, each weighs 25 kilograms, ready to be detonated by a wireless remote control. In Hama, a terrorist detonated an explosive device as a convoy carrying law enforcement personnel was passing by Al Iskan Square. No casualties were reported. Authorities shot the terrorist dead. Meanwhile, engineering units dismantled another explosive device that was planted in the same area. In Hama countryside, an armed terrorist group attacked a minibus carrying workers going on their way back home. One of the workers was killed and another was wounded and taken to a hospital near Jibramle.
That has been targeting the Syrian people discloses the size of the conspiracy hatched against Syria and the participation of many sides in implementing this conspiracy. U.S. Director of National Intelligence James Clapper said that it is likely that Al-Qaeda branch in Iraq has carried out the suicide bombings that took place in Syria recently, after Al-Qaeda members infiltrated to the opposition. Agence France-Presse reported Clapper as saying at a hearing before the American Senate that Al-Qaeda is behind bombings in Damascus and Aleppo. He pointed out that militants from Al-Qaeda and extremists managed to infiltrate among the divided Syrian opposition, adding that the Syrian government is able to remain in power. For his part, Adnan al-Asadi, a former official at the Iraqi Interior Ministry, confirmed that Iraqi militants headed from Iraq to Syria and that smuggling weapons from Iraq to Syria through borders is still continuing. On the other hand, Adel al-Jawjari, editor-in-chief of Al-Anwar Egyptian paper, underlined that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are taking part in supporting the armed groups in Syria.
There is a Western Arab attempt to destroy the Syrian government with all of its institutions. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are trying to carry out this task because they have become part and parcel of the so-called Greater Middle East, or the Second Sykes-Picot that supports Israel. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are supporting the armed terrorist groups in Syria with money and providing them with the most developed Israeli weapons to destroy the tanks and to target the industrial establishments.
The Syrian community in Jordan, as well as popular and media figures, staged a sit-in before the Syrian embassy in Amman to express support for Syria in the face of the international plot targeting Syria and the Arab region. Participants raised the Syrian flag and posters of President Bashar al-Assad, chanting slogans expressing support for Syria and reform. They also expressed condemnation of the armed terrorist groups and the crimes they are committing against the citizens and properties. They also hailed the Russian and Chinese stances and the stances of the countries which support Syria in the face of the conspiracy targeting it. Russian President Dmitry Medvedev granted Pushkin Medal to Syrian writer Ali Oqla Arsan. Here's more.
Russian President Dmitry Medvedev stressed his support for the efforts being exerted by President Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian leadership to implement the reforms in Syria. The remarks came during a state award-granting ceremony for foreign nationals held in Moscow to grant the Russian poet Alexander Pushkin Medal. President Medvedev granted the medals to many intellectuals, scientists and artists from different countries, including the former chairman of the Arab Writers Union, Ali Oqla Arsan from Syria.
Russia has deeply rooted relations with the countries represented by the winners of the medals. The new generation should work to preserve these relations and enhance them.
I'm honored to express salutation and appreciation for Russia's president, government and people for their stances in defending the freedom and the prosperity, preventing the use of the human rights to impose political options on the others, and their standing confidently in the face of the aggression, terrorism and foreign interference attempts in the country's internal affairs.
And finally, most Syrian cities witnessed rain and snowfalls over the mountaintops and some mid-areas. The thickness of snow in the provinces of Damascus and its countryside ranged between 10 and 20 centimeters. The Traffic Management Department asked drivers to check their brakes, take caution, and reduce speed while approaching downhills and intersections in order to avoid accidents. Well, this brings our news bulletin to a close. Many thanks for joining us. For more news, you can visit our website in English, SyriaOnline.sy. Khalid Sakhbani joins us now with Economy News.